This lecture is an introduction to the Italian Renaissance. Understanding the art of this period begins with an understanding of what the Renaissance was as a cultural movement. So, our course begins with this question: what is the Renaissance? The term Renaissance was coined in 1855 by the French historian Jules Michelet in his Renaissance and Reform. Some scholars prefer to use the Italian equivalent, Rinascimento, for what is largely an Italian phenomenon. Either way, it generally refers to the post-medieval rebirth of antique or classical Greco-Roman culture, literature, and art, all with a new interest in innovation. The term modern was used for this reinvigoration of the arts by the Italians themselves of the 1400s. Incidentally, you might consider the 19th century avant-garde and its commitment to modernity, even though the end product was quite different. The Italian Renaissance began in the Quattrocento, the 1400s or 15th century, although some nascent indications of the movement appeared in the Trecento, 1300s. It reached its peak during the High Renaissance from about 1492 to 1525. The concept of the Renaissance was developed with more coherence by the Swiss historian Jacob Burckhardt, who, in his Civilization of the Italian Renaissance, contrasted the innovations of the modern period with the obscurantism of the medieval period. So, the Renaissance, beginning in Florence around 1400, is defined by contrast to the earlier medieval period. First of all, a contrast of intellectualism to this alleged medieval obscurantism, and a contrast of stylistic classicism to the style pejoratively labeled as Gothic by the modern 15th century Italians. But now we have some new questions. What is Gothic and what is classical? To understand the classical, let's start by looking at a map of Europe. The modern national boundaries are indicated, but the Greek peoples did not have a unified nation in the antique period. Instead, they inhabited those parts of the Mediterranean shore highlighted in red on the smaller inset map, although they spread from a homeland that is in today's country of Greece. The Greeks, starting in the 5th century BC, elaborated the art that we call classical. It can be defined most succinctly as a unique blend of naturalism and idealism. That's to say, they represented the world around them, and particularly human figures, in a way that was completely compatible with not only the laws of nature, including correct proportions, anatomical accuracy, and so forth, but also in natural postures or ways of standing. The Contrapposto Pose featured in the statue of the Doryphoros here was a Greek invention that broke with the rigid and rather unnatural approaches to figurative sculpture that preceded it. The other so-called classical antique culture was that of the Romans, who had a vast empire around the Mediterranean, including those territories that they conquered from the Greeks. In a much broader territory, which included conquered Greece, the Romans expanded on this tradition of classical naturalism and idealism. In fact, Roman visual culture is largely appropriated from ancient Greece, but is largely through Roman statues and relief sculptures that the Italians of the Renaissance became familiar with the classical style. This style had been lost, in a manner of speaking, after the so-called barbarian invasions that culminated in the fall of Rome in 476 AD and fragmented the Roman Empire while redistributing ethnic groups in Europe. This was the onset of the Dark Ages, so called because much knowledge, including artistic knowledge and technology, was lost or shrouded in darkness during this time of economic collapse and socio-political upheaval. A more neutral name for the period between the fall of Rome and the Renaissance is medieval, or the Middle Ages. It might also be stylized as the Age of Faith, as religion predominated in all aspects of life. Here you can see a religious image typical of the art of the time, a rendering of the Virgin Mary with the baby Jesus on her lap. the stylistic contrasts with the naturalism of Greco-Roman classical art are starkly noticeable. It is really towards the end of the Middle Ages, or around 1100, that the Gothic style appears in cathedrals such as this one at Chartres, and progresses from north of the Alps into Italy. In any case, how can we characterize Gothic art, particularly as it relates to our ideas of a medieval society or Dark Ages? I usually ask students to look at these images and to explain how they reflect the norms of medieval society. Hopefully the religious content struck you first and foremost, but there are other stereotypical aspects of medieval life represented here, such as the king that stands at the head of the feudal system, or the social hierarchy with a minority of nobles at the top and majority of peasants at the bottom. You will also see the image of knights jousting, as one rarely thinks of the Middle Ages without thinking of knights, castles, holy crusades, and everything that goes with them. Overall, the Middle Ages has this reputation of being a dark time with too much emphasis on not only religion, but on Catholicism's view of hell. And yet, all of these images here date to the Renaissance and are by Renaissance artists. As such, we should remember that the Renaissance is not such a neatly categorized time. I will explain how humans once again became the subject of primary interest, just as they were in antiquity, but we should not forget the Renaissance was still a time of deep religious devotion. Science was certainly reinvigorated during the Renaissance period, but it still had a long way to go, and religion was still the central focus of artistic life as well as life in general, especially throughout the early Renaissance. It was a time when humanity and divinity seemed to vie for the upper hand, but the interest and commitment to both, almost equally, was a change from the medieval period. As this cultural change happened, in artistic terms, forms are moving back towards the Greco-Roman approach to representation after a long hiatus. That's to say, representational art looks more true to life, or true to nature. This is why we call it naturalistic. In the Renaissance, you see depictions of figures that are both lifelike and ideally beautiful. A 2D medieval work might look like this: schematic, abstracted, with non-naturalistic space, proportions, or scaling. Its purpose is narrative, that's to say, to tell a story, and this story is primarily spiritual, i.e., the stories of Christianity. The Renaissance returned to a realistic sense of space, proportion, scaling, and atmosphere. Although the purpose was still narrative, this aim is almost usurped by an aesthetic goal. That's to say, with making the most beautiful image possible. But this aim could still be considered spiritual, as beauty was considered godly. Please note that you will need to study the vocabulary terms introduced in the prerequisite survey course in order to discuss works of art, the primary focus of this course and the substance of the final exam. I will certainly be talking about these terms throughout the course, but do look at the handouts so words like proportion, scaling, modeling, etc. are familiar to you. The Renaissance may be divided into two major periods: the early Renaissance, which takes up most of the 1400s, and the High Renaissance, which starts shortly before 1500 and ends by about 1525. You can see the notable characteristics of each here. I have further divided the Renaissance into these time periods, which I would like you to recognize. The Trecento, which is the Italian word for the 1300s, as the century is called in Italian Renaissance studies. Then there is a first generation, or prima generazione, of early Renaissance artists and artworks. This is followed by a second and third generation that incrementally introduce innovative ideas in the field of art and architecture. The High Renaissance, dated a bit more precisely, if precision is really even possible in such a broad historical movement, follows. And then the purview of the class ends with the later 16th century, which is also the time when mannerism generally flourished. All in all, the class covers about 3 centuries, from the 1300s to the 1500s, and about 4 different major styles, with a couple of subcategories. This course will move forward chronologically, although there may be exceptions for thematic progressions. Therefore, I suggest getting a handle on the chronology and the major distinctions between periods.